Good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Joe Barton. I am one of the trustees for the Moya Library, Ross Historical Society. I want to welcome you here today. Thank you for supporting this program. Before we begin, I just want to mention that, this is a webinar, and this is a view-only webinar. And if you have any questions, you're welcome to use at the bottom of your screen. You'll see where you can use the Q&A or the chat to give us questions when Paola is speaking. I think we're going to take most of the questions at the end of the program, so Paola can speak through her presentation. If you'd like to ask a question audio-wise, you can raise your hand, and I can bring you into the program, and you can speak with us over audio. And let's see. Lastly, I just want to thank all of our members and benefactors for supporting the Moya Library, Ross Historical Society. This presentation is made possible thanks to your generosity. And with that, I'd like to introduce our historian and trustee, Richard Turney, who will introduce the program today.
All right, thank you, Joe, and welcome, and thank all of you for your interest and support. This is our final first Friday forenoon program of the 2021 season. We are making reservations for use of the Livermore Pavilion at the Art and Garden Center for 2022, and hope that we'll be able to safely host live presentations next year. When the schedule is completed, it will be posted on our website. Now I'd like to introduce our guest speaker, Paola Coda, who is Jose Moya del Pino's granddaughter and has been fascinated with her grandfather's life works ever since moving from Italy to California many years ago. She is a graphic designer and holds a degree from Stanford University. Paola has a passion for art and photography and is an avid traveler. She is author of a history book about her family's castle in Tuscany, Montalto Castello di Frontiera, written in Italian, and a photography book, Montalto Castle, 1,000 Years of History, written in English. Today, she will be sharing some of her research about her remarkable grandfather. So please welcome Paola Coda.
Thank you for the introduction, Richard, and hello, everybody. So as mentioned, I had just published a book on my grandfather's life and works, and it took about three years of research on both sides of the Atlantic, and I learned some things that I didn't know before. So it's kind of fun to share them. Some of you already know that my grandfather came to US from Spain at the age of 35, but most of us didn't know much at all about his life before this. And a few years ago, Miguel Forcada Serrano, who's a writer and historian in Priego, Spain, which is Moya del Pino's birthplace, he contacted me to get information on his life in California. And we started this collaboration to combine together the information that he was able to find in Spain with the information that I could find over here on these kind of two separate lives. And the result is this book, which is very detailed and includes a number of photos and images from both parts of his life. And one of the things that kept coming up as I was doing this research was how gregarious my grandfather was and how easy it was for him to make friends. And I don't have time today to talk about Moya del Pino's entire life or to show his entire body of work. So I thought that today I would focus instead on some of the key relationships in his life, just to kind of narrow down a little bit the scope of the talk. Otherwise, we would keep going on forever. So Moya, first of all, he liked to be called Moya as an adult, not Jose. He had a very ebullient personality. He was gregarious. He liked to talk. He gesticulated a lot when he talked, and he made friends very easily, even when he didn't speak their language. So one of his greatest skills was forging relationships, and these relationships in turn often had a deep impact on his life. So I'd just like to talk about a few that were pivotal, that made a difference in his life. So Jose Moya del Pino was born in 1890, and his first big adventure happened when he was 10 or 11, and he met the itinerant painter Carlos Mouton. Now, one of the biographies that I read calls him Carlos Manton and says that he was from Cordoba, and two others call him Mouton, and they say he was a Frenchman. So that's what I'm choosing to call him here. We don't really know for sure because this was not a famous painter, so no records of him remain. And so for this relationship, unfortunately, we have very little information other than what Moya tells us himself in interviews with biographers or with journalists later in his life. And with no detailed information, I won't be able to show you any images. This one is an example that I found on the web, and I have no idea if it's accurate to his work, but it's an example of religious art in the countryside of Andalusia at that time. And as you can see, usually the saints would be, they could be rather generic, but they usually held objects in their hands to identify them. They were symbols of how they were martyred or symbols of their sainthood. So anyway, so Mouton was what is called an itinerant painter. And right around 1900, there were a number of them in Andalusia, which is the region in the south of Spain where Moya del Pino was born. And they would make a living going from village to village, painting altarpieces, ex-votos, or images of saints for the peasants. And Carlos Mouton had a workshop in Alcalá la Real that Jose Moya del Pino used to walk by on his way to school when he was about 10, 11 years old. And Moya was a very curious kid, not shy at all, and he kept peeking in. And so they struck up a friendship. And then when the painter left town to roam the countryside, he would go from village to village, from fair to fair, painting to make a living. And Jose ran away from home to be his apprentice. And this was a big adventure in his life. And I promise that these are the only text slides that I will show. It's just because I have no art to show for this painter. This up here is a quote from an interview that Moya gave years later for the Archives of American Art for the Smithsonian Institution. So these itinerant painters mostly raffled off paintings, or at least this is what we hear from Jose, that at least Mouton, this is what he did. He raffled off paintings usually, and often for goods rather than money, as many of the villagers didn't have a lot of money. But they would also paint specific ex-votos when somebody wanted to invoke a specific saint. And Mouton would make his own colors and prepared his own canvases, but Jose ground the colors for him. And the colors were put into a casing made from the intestines of a pig. And this was not a very sophisticated method, but it helped him understand pigments and the mixing of colors, which he would later use in his life. And this adventure is what got Moya started on his artistic career. They would sleep on straw, and he got back home in tatters and with bloodshot eyes, because apparently he was also drinking too much, but he was determined to be an artist. His parents had been frantically looking for him, and they were appalled at his state when he returned, but he was determined, and they had to accept that he wanted to be an artist and agreed to send him to art school. So this adventure determined his entire future career path. And in Madrid, after he studied at the Royal Academy of Art, which, by the way, the Royal Academy of Art is now a museum, but at the time it was one of the most well-known art schools in the, well, Western, at least, world. And as he was finishing his studies, he met Don Ramon del Valle Inclán, who was one of the most charismatic figures of the early 20th century in Madrid. The picture on the right here is a woodcut portrait made by Moya del Pino. Don Ramon was a writer and a real pioneer in introducing graphic arts and book illustration in his works. And he did quite a number of books, actually, between 1910 and 1920. And the two of them met at a cafe where writers and artists used to get together. In fact, Moya del Pino was the youngest member of one of the tertulias, which were groups of artists and writers and poets who would meet regularly at these cafes. And there were a few of these cafes, actually, but in particular, the Nuevo Café Levante, which is where Valle Inclán would essentially hold court. He would talk about just about anything, and people would hang from his lips as he told his stories. And while studying in Paris and London, Moya had been introduced to the techniques of book illustration. And so Valle Inclán hired him in 1911, along with some other artists in this case, to illustrate his Voces de Gesta, which means tales of great deeds. This was a tragedy in verse. And Moya was 21 at that time. And for the first book, this one on the left, he only did some page frames and some side illustrations. He did bigger illustrations for future books. But the two, Valle Inclán and Moya, totally hit it off. And they seemed to have a deep understanding of each other's work. And from then on, they collaborated for 10 years on all of the writers' projects. This one is Aromas de Leyendas, another book by Valle Inclán. And there was a great rapport between the two. They really understood each other. And in total, Moya del Pino illustrated 15 of Valle Inclán's books and short stories between 1911 and 1919. The most successful were Sonata de Primavera and La Lámpara Maravillosa, both of which had several reprints throughout the years. And La Lámpara Maravillosa in particular has inspired a number of studies and dissertations and is still available in reissues today. And all 35 illustrations in this book are by Moya del Pino. And they're quite vivid. The illustrations are purely decorative. They consist of stylized plants and images of chalices, torches, jellyfish heads, skulls, eagles, and other animals. And it's kind of funny, they almost look like tattoos right now, don't they? And in 2017, this book was reissued. And there's an introduction that describes in detail the synergy between the writer and the artist. Here's a quote. "It can be said that the illustrations that enrich this edition are a book inside a book, a key that serves to decode an intense and rapturously luminous book." And the introduction also explains that the author and the illustrator shared the same vision. So this book is still being reissued in modern times. There's an edition from 2018 that also includes a study of the intellectual relationship between writer and illustrator. There was a 607-page doctoral thesis by a doctoral student at the University of Madrid, which talks about the symbolism of the images and how it relates to the text, essentially to create a map with stages for the progression of the soul. I didn't read the text of this. I just looked at the images because it's all in Spanish. And the relationship between Moya del Pino and Valle Inclán was also a subject of an article in a magazine in 2009, and which says that the relationship was enriching for both. And here's a quote. "I say for both because the two influenced each other by establishing a fluid dialogue of artists who combined their voices to give rise to some of the most exalted works of Spanish modernism. So even to this day, the relationship between the writer and the artist is commented on. It was an important one for both of them. And Moya del Pino achieved some fame with these illustrations, and not just illustrations for Valle Inclán, but also for a number of other artists, for other writers. And here are some covers that he did for books by other authors. And for these, he did all the interior illustrations as well. And at the same time, he was also painting portraits of society people. And he attracted the eye of the Duke of Alba, a known patron of the arts. And getting favor with the Duke is one thing that contributed to moving Moya into the second part of his life. So while he had been in London, Moya del Pino had seen an exhibition of poor quality carbon photographs of the works of Velázquez. And this exhibition had quite a success. But he thought it was so sad to reduce these gorgeous paintings to carbon copies. And he thought it would be great to make actual copies of the Velázquez paintings to show to the world. So he presented this idea to the Duke of Alba, who liked the idea. And the Duke brought it to the King of Spain, who enthusiastically approved the project. And in essence, Moya would not have gotten the support of the king without the help of the Duke of Alba. So here's another relationship that actually proved influential. And this, by the way, is a photo of the Duke next to the portrait made by Moya del Pino. And here's a portrait that Moya del Pino made of the king. And this is particularly interesting. The king had, by this point, been portrayed so many times since he was a child, and always in military uniform or noble fancy dress. And for this portrait, instead, he posed in civilian clothes. And it's the most human and down to earth of the portraits that have ever been made of him. Here's a story that Moya liked to tell, and this is a quote. "When the portrait was finished, I presented it to the king for his approval. After contemplating his likeness for a while in silence, he smiled and said to me, joking, 'Thank God, for once I do not feel like the picture on a deck of cards.'" Moya liked to tell stories, so this is one that he repeated frequently. Now, the king, Alfonso XIII, he was a great promoter of tourism in Spain. This was a few years after the flu of 1918-1919, and people had been calling this the Spanish flu, and they've been avoiding Spain, and so tourism in the country was down. It's actually not very clear what the origins of this flu were, but during World War I and in the following years, many countries were still censoring their communications and not letting information out about how gravely hit they were, while Spain remained neutral, shared information with the world, and so appeared to be more hardly hit. And even the king had gotten very sick, and the newspapers talked about it. This newspaper here on the left, El Sol, talks about 80,000 people affected in Madrid. His Majesty the king is also sick. And all these newspapers, all these news contributed to the impression that Spain was the worst area. These articles here are from Spain, the US, England, and Canada. And it's interesting to see that there was some controversy about masks back then too. So essentially, travel to Spain was down, and that had an effect on the economy. And the king wanted to revive tourism and the economy as a whole. So he liked the idea of introducing other countries to Spain's artistic masterpieces to convince people that it was worth traveling to that country. And that's one of the reasons he gave his support. And he also helped finance this idea of doing the copies of Velázquez. So Moya was commissioned to copy all the paintings of Velázquez that are in the Prado Museum. And he did them at actual size with the same pigments used in the 17th century to make them as accurate as possible. And then he was going to travel around the Western world to show these works, to show everybody how great the art and culture of Spain was. He spent 4 years copying all the portraits, and then he left for the United States, which was actually supposed to be only one of several stops he was going to make. He had originally planned on going through Europe as well and was going to go to South America too. But the first stop was the United States, and this is what brought him to America. And after shows in New York and Philadelphia and Washington, the show came here to the De Young Museum in San Francisco. But this relationship with the Duke and the King, it got him to the United States, but it couldn't get him back because things were getting complicated in Spain. It was on the brink of a civil war, and the king was falling into disfavor. He actually eventually was exiled, and General Primo de Rivera had absolutely no interest in supporting this mission. So Moya del Pino got stranded in San Francisco. He had these huge paintings, but he had no money, and he couldn't continue the expedition, and he couldn't go back to Spain. And this then is what started the next phase of his life. So when Moya got stranded in San Francisco, he had no money, and he didn't speak much English, and he had to figure out how to earn a living. Now, we don't know where he lived, but we think it would have been probably in or near the building called the Monkey Block in the North Beach area of San Francisco, because he soon made friends with a number of painters and writers and sculptors that either lived or had studios in that building. And some of them are well-known names. He didn't speak very much English, but it didn't matter. He just loved people, and he found ways to communicate, and they all became friends. So he became a part of this bohemian world. And it was not just artists, but also wealthy patrons and socialites and some business people. So not just artists like him, but people that can commission work also. So here is an example. Otis Oldfield, he was a painter, printmaker, and art teacher. And I'll talk about him some more later, but they became especially good friends. Oldfield was also involved in Coit Tower, as we'll see in a bit. Ralph Stackpole was one of San Francisco's leading sculptors in the 1920s and 30s. He was also one of the Coit Tower muralists, and he also did sculptures for the Golden Gate International Exposition on Treasure Island. Maynard Dixon was a well-known artist who focused on the American West, and he was married to Dorothea Lange, a documentary photographer who's well-known for Depression-era work. And, well, everybody knows Ansel Adams, of course, but Edward Weston, he's been called one of the most innovative and influential American photographers. I got a quote from Wikipedia that says that he developed a quintessentially American and especially Californian approach to modern photography. And he was a good friend. John Bowles was a prominent architect. He was president of the California Council of Architects, and he's the one who designed Candlestick Park and the Embarcadero Plaza in San Francisco and a number of Macy's stores. He ended up being a good friend, and he actually wrote Moya's eulogy when he passed away. Gardner Daly, also an architect, he designed a number of buildings for UC Berkeley and UC Davis and Stanford University, and also did the Brazilian Pavilion for the Golden Gate International Exposition in 1939-1940. And he, by the way, is the one they introduced Moya to his future wife and designed their home when they moved to Marin. And these, by the way, are photos of Moya del Pino taken by Edward Weston and by Ansel Adams. So Otis Oldfield, in particular, he became a good, long-lasting friend. Oldfield had been in Paris at the same time as Moya, but they were in different circles and they never met. They actually met in San Francisco, and they became good, lifelong friends. These are some of his paintings, Oldfield's paintings. And the portrait of the man in the upper right, by the way, is a portrait of Edward Weston. So they really all knew each other. They were all friends. When the WPA was hiring artists to paint frescoes in Coit Tower, Oldfield wanted to participate, but he didn't really know how to do fresco. So he was able to convince the guy who was selecting the painters for the project. That was Walter Heil. He was the director of the Young Museum. So he convinced Heil to let him do his painting, but in oil on canvas instead of fresco. And a canvas painting would have stood out too much among the other frescoes. So it was decided to do it in the elevator lobby. And Oldfield brought in his friends, Moya and Rinaldo Cuneo, and that entire lobby is their work. So Moya actually did know how to do fresco, but oil painting was the best medium for this lobby. It could work for all of them. And so this is how Moya ended up painting in Coit Tower, which is probably his best known work at this point, or at least his most widely seen one. His painting is a view of the San Francisco Bay from the point of view of somebody standing in exactly that same spot in Coit Tower and looking north. And in it, he also gives tribute to his friend Oldfield, as if you look at the two figures at the bottom of the painting, one of them is Oldfield drawing, and the other one is Moya himself looking over his shoulder. Now, in Moya's painting, you can see Alcatraz Island in the upper left there. And the one by Oldfield, right next to it, includes Yerba Buena Island. This is before Treasure Island was built. So these two are intended to be different views of the San Francisco Bay, one taken looking north and one taken looking east, from the same vantage point of Coit Tower, looking down the hill and onto the water. And Rinaldo Cuneo also did, he actually did two murals here, but I couldn't find a picture of the second one, or at least not a good picture. There were some small faded ones. And he did two murals, and he also did some decorations above the doors. And here again, some other artists that Moya was hanging out with. This group in particular, these were artists involved in the Golden Gate International Exposition, but some of those were also muralists in Coit Tower. And Moya is the tallest one in the middle. The first two and the guy right in front of Moya are Lucien Lebeau, Antonio Sotomayor, and Otis Oldfield. And they all did murals for both the Coit Tower and the Golden Gate International Exposition. And the man at the far right is architect Timothy Pfluger, and I want to talk about him next. But also in this photo is Diego Rivera sitting on the left. Now, Moya and Rivera had already met in Paris years before, and they had become friends there. It was through Diego Rivera that Moya also met Leo and Gertrude Stein. He says that he went to their apartment, and that was the first time that he was introduced to the paintings of Picasso and Matisse, which would temporarily influence his painting style. And Moya and Rivera picked up their friendship again when Rivera came to San Francisco to paint a mural for the San Francisco Stock Exchange. And I have a quote of how Moya remembers his friends. He says, Rivera, he had a tummy, a paunch. He was always full of paint and grease and cigarette butts. But at the same time, Diego had enormous culture. I used to say about Diego changes his artistic style depending on his marriages. Usually we had lunch together in the cafeteria. Sometimes I would visit him when he was painting the mural in the stock exchange, and I would climb the scaffolding because he liked to talk sometimes and he was painting. I would tell him that I didn't want to distract him, and he would say, "Oh, Moya, I like to talk. You don't distract me. Let us talk." And we would just talk about anything that came to mind. So especially when they were working on the Golden Gate International Exposition, they spent a lot of time together. That's when they were eating in the cafeteria of the exposition together. And Rivera was painting his big Pan-American Unity mural. And so the guy on the right in here is Timothy Pfluger, a prominent architect. And I wanted to mention him because this is another relationship that had an influence on Moya's life too. So Moya was an architect, Pfluger was an architect, interior designer, and architectural lighting designer. And he designed some of the leading skyscrapers and movie theaters in San Francisco. He also liked to use emergent artists to decorate his buildings. The Pacific Telephone and Telegraph building was actually the tallest building in San Francisco for 40 years after it was built. Pfluger also designed the Castro Theater in San Francisco, and he designed the bars and lounges of the Top of the Mark at the Mark Hopkins, the St. Francis Hotel, and the Fairmont. So Pfluger was, among other things, the chairman of the Committee of Architects working on the Bay Bridge. And in 1932, Moya del Pino was hired to do a set of murals for the Merchants Exchange Club. And you can actually still see these today. The Merchants Exchange Club, it is now a special event venue in San Francisco. And the murals show San Francisco at various times in the past and present. And the third one of them that I put here shows the present and future of the city. And it's got steamships and airplanes, got a dirigible in the sky. And in the foreground, there are steel workers building skyscrapers to represent the development of the city. And I'm sorry they only have a black and white photo of this. This was scanned from an article in the San Francisco Chronicle from April 1933, when the murals were unveiled. The photos from the Merchants Exchange Club itself, they're too zoomed out. So they're not very clear. You can't really see the paintings in there. But what's interesting to see in this third painting is that the mural contains a very realistic Bay Bridge. But at that point, the bridge hadn't been constructed yet. And in fact, they didn't even break ground on it until a couple of months after these murals were completed. So how could Moya know what it was going to look like? Well, here's where the friendship with Timothy Pfluger came in. Since he was the chairman of the architects working on the bridge, he must have shown Moya the plans. There's no other way he could have known. And by the way, if you look at this painting and some of the construction workers in a lot of Rivera's paintings, you can kind of see some resemblances. There are some similarities, and Diego Rivera's Pan-American Unity mural was painted 7 years after Moya's, but I think clearly they kind of influenced each other when, since they worked together so much. And Pfluger was also chairman of the committee responsible for the design of the Golden Gate International Exposition in 1939. And this exposition was a big deal. Treasure Island was built completely from scratch for this. And they built a number of buildings and fountains, gardens and statues for it. And Pfluger asked Moya to do one of the widest murals of the fair for the Temple of Religion building. This mural was 196 feet wide. And it represents the hand of God guiding man through the various phases of his life. It's the biggest single project Moya ever did. He did do some other murals for the Golden Gate International Exposition for the California building, but unfortunately, all of these buildings were torn down at the end of the fair. So all we have in color for the Temple of Religion are these cartoon sketches that Moya did for them. And the Moya Library has them now. So this is a massive project. And Moya might not have gotten it without his friendship with Pfluger. And we have to remember that when he got stranded in San Francisco, so Moya was completely broke. He had no support from his homeland, and he didn't speak English very well. So what could he do? Well, luckily, when he arrived in San Francisco with the paintings, the Spanish consul had organized parties and receptions and had introduced Moya to San Francisco high society, introducing him to patrons of the art as a prominent Spanish artist sent by the king, which sounded kind of impressive. So he had good introductions to various influential people. And even if he didn't speak English very well, he was very good at making connections. And this was useful, he said, as being invited to banquets allowed him to at least eat once in a while. He told his daughters years later that he looked forward to these banquets and he would eat as much as possible in these occasions because he didn't know where his next meal would come from. The trustees of the De Young Museum also gave him some good introductions to other patrons of the arts that he was able to turn into commissions for paintings. So when he needed to make a living, the easiest thing was to go back to making portraits. And he painted the wife and daughter of Alfred Sutro. Edward Hanna, Archbishop Hanna, helped him find a home for the Velázquez painting that he still had to figure out what to do with, and later officiated in Moya's wedding. Moya painted a number of high society ladies and professors at Stanford and UC Berkeley and doctors. He painted Margaret Pillsbury, Mrs. Francis Gump, and in fact, he had a number of art shows at Gump's gallery. And I actually don't know who many of these portraits are, I have to say. All we have is unlabeled photographs of the paintings before they were delivered to their clients. And they're unlabeled, so I don't know who they are, but they all seem like pretty wealthy or elegant people, at least. And it's through these high society contacts that he met his future wife, Helen. They met at a party introduced by architect Gardner Bailey. And her father, Helen's father, was a very successful merchant and grower and exporter of hops. In fact, in 1912, the Clemens Horst Company owned the largest number of acres of hops in the world. He supplied most of the breweries in the US and some in Europe as well, including Guinness in Ireland. And even when Prohibition came, he was able to make it through because even when it was illegal to make beer, you could still export hops abroad. So he was a successful man and he was well off. And his daughter, Helen, apparently had many suitors. But I suppose nobody could resist Moya's energy, his exuberance, maybe his accent, and also his good looks. And since I mentioned his good looks, I figured I should include a slide where you can see his face, the way he looked like when he was young. This is during his first years in California. This is a passport photo from 1933 or 34. He was 44 years old at this point. And I read an interview with Otis Oldfield's wife, where she said that he was a gorgeous man, and that's a direct quote. She says he was tall and had piercing blue eyes and commanded the attention of everybody anytime he walked into a room. And she said that women were all crazy about him. And some of her friends flipped. That's a direct quote also, every time they saw him. And Helen was a bit of a free spirit too. For example, she drove a Packard Roadster with an open top and an egg beater mounted onto its hood, which would twirl in the wind when she drove. And when they first met, and in the first year of their marriage as well, they spoke in French to each other because they had both studied in France, and it was the only language that they had in common, since at the beginning, Moya didn't speak English very well at all. Helen, by the way, was actually a good artist too. She gave up painting after getting married so that she wouldn't compete with her husband, but she kept doing sculpture and jewelry and other arts. She just didn't paint anymore. The newspapers at the time reported on their wedding, and partly because it was a society wedding, but also because Helen and her sister Beatrice were married at the same time, which made the double wedding even more interesting. The Society Club's fashion section of the San Francisco Examiner devoted almost 3/4 of a page to describing the guests, the flower girls, the decorations. And as I mentioned, San Francisco Archbishop Hannah officiated the wedding. And it's probably also through the influence of Clem Horst that Moya was hired by the Aztec Brewery in San Diego to do murals for their new tasting room. It's probable that Clem Horst, he must definitely have introduced Moya to other successful businessmen. And in this case, San Diego is pretty far from the Bay Area, but it was probably the connection with the hops and brewery industry that got him this job. And Moya del Pino also supervised other decorations, like the stained glass windows, hand-carved tables, and decorated walls and ceiling. And he researched this thoroughly to be able to represent accurately the Aztec world. The central piece behind the bar on the left, this has now been cut into pieces and reassembled in the Logan Library in San Diego because the building itself was torn down. And this photo is actually from the library. It's not an original from the original tasting room building. And after the success of the Aztec Brewery, he also did murals for Acme Brewery in San Francisco. This is now the African American Art and Culture Center on Fulton Street, if you want to go and see the Acme Brewery murals. And at this point, he had made a name for himself in this field. So he was also called to do murals for the tasting room of the Great Western Malting Company in Vancouver, Washington. And I could actually do an entire talk on my grandfather's murals, especially the post offices, the ones done under the WPA. And you can still see several of them today, but that's another subject, that's another time. Anyway, another thing about Clem Horst that I wanted to mention, when the Civil War broke in Spain and Madrid was being bombed, Moya del Pino's mother and sister, they were stuck in Madrid and they couldn't get out. And it was actually Clem Horst who arranged for them to get visas and financed their evacuation, which was still quite an ordeal, actually. I know the details because Moya's sister Esposita describes the evacuation in her memoirs. And it still took 14 months, but essentially they wouldn't have been able to move to the US without Clem Horst's help. So when Moya and Helen moved to Marin County, they integrated into society here, into the North Bay artistic world. Moya had already been teaching at the California School of Fine Arts, which is now called the San Francisco Art Institute. And he was teaching at the College of Marin and became president of the Marin Society of Artists. And Helen was active in society and loved gardening and was involved in the Marin Garden Club, through which they met Caroline Livermore. And Caroline was an amazing woman. She was very active in environmental protection. And among other things, she established the Marin Conservation League, through which they protected Stinson Beach, which later became a state park. And they bought land at Tomales Bay to turn it into a state park also. And she protected the Mount Tamalpais watershed from development and the Marin headlands. She created the Point Reyes National Seashore Foundation. And then through the Angel Island Foundation, they bought Angel Island and they made it into a state park. And in fact, the tallest peak on the island is called Mount Livermore in her honor. So she was amazing and really involved in preserving land and protecting places that were at risk of being developed. And at that time, there was this estate of the Kittles and Warren families in Marin that was at risk of being subdivided and urbanized. And she wanted to protect this as well. So with help of a number of other people and the Marin Garden Club, they bought the land and created the Marin Art and Garden Center. And Helen and Jose joined the efforts from the very beginning. So the center was established in 1945, and Caroline Livermore was president, and Jose Moya del Pino was vice president. And Jose Moya del Pino was also president of the Marin Society of Artists, and that was in fact the first of the guilds that became part of the new Marin Art and Garden Center. And years later, when Moya got really sick, this was towards the end of his life, and he couldn't participate anymore in the activities of the center. So Caroline Livermore wanted to find a way to honor his life and his contributions to the Art and Garden Center. And they asked him what would be an appropriate tribute. And Helen suggested a library that could be, in her words, the cultural and educational heart of the center. They were always thinking of the original idea of the association as a non-commercial cultural center. And so that's how it was decided to move and rehabilitate the Octagon House and turn it into the Moya del Pino Library. And now it houses the Ross Historical Society as well. And so this brings us to today. This library is really the main physical memory of him, since his portraits and landscapes and other paintings he did, they're mostly in the hands of families who commissioned them. So they're not visible to the public. All you can really see is some of his murals. Many of the WPA murals are still visible in post offices throughout California. And also there's Coit Tower, of course. But this library is a symbol of his life and his contributions to the art and culture of the Bay Area. And well, both Moya and Caroline Livermore, they died before the renovation was finished. So they never really got to see it. But this is the Moya del Pino Library that does these First Friday forenoon lectures that you are attending today. So maybe you know now a little bit more about my grandfather's works and the exciting life he had and all the friendships in high places. And if you want to know more, you can take a look at my book. It takes some time to deliver, so you have to be patient after they're ordered. And Amazon seems to charge an exorbitant price for it, but I'm proud of it. And actually, so this, by the way, in the background here, this is a painting from his Joshua Tree series. Moya had gone to Lancaster in Southern California to paint a mural for the post office there. And he was totally impressed with the twisted shapes of these Joshua trees. So when he got back home, he kept painting them for a while. And there's some paintings that are actually much more abstract than this. And I love that. I love those, and I love this one in particular. These are some of my favorites. But essentially, they're intended to be the landscape of the Southern California desert. And I'm sorry that, so we didn't get a chance to talk much about Moya's landscapes or the other paintings and portraits he did just for himself, not a commission. We only talked about his commissions, but there would have just been too much to cover otherwise. So that was why I tried to focus this on the relationships. So anyway, if any of you want to stay longer, I can answer some questions.
Thanks very much, Paula. This is Fran Capoletti, also of Moya Library. And I do have a question. This comes from Tom Perry. Thanking you for the presentation. And his question is, as a founding member of the Marin Art and Garden Center, was it Moya who introduced Gardner Daly to the center? Interesting question.
I thought I would show you my face. You know, I actually don't know. I would guess that it was because they've been friends for so many years. I mean, they had been friends even before they moved to the Bay Area, to Marin County. So I would guess that the friendship was instrumental in this, but to be honest, I don't actually know for sure.
It would be an interesting question to solve with further research if possible. But yes. Here's a question. What happened to the Velázquez paintings?
That is such a long story. That is such a long story. Essentially, they ended up going to the UC Berkeley Library. An association was formed. This was to try and help figure out what to do, just to get them. There was no money to even store them, unfortunately. They were so big at that point. So an association of Spanish citizens of San Francisco, led by Archbishop Hanna, got together and committed to purchasing the paintings in order to donate them to UC Berkeley, because there was a lot of space in the library to put them up along the ceiling. There was all this very, very tall ceiling with all this space on it. Unfortunately, two things. One, the money never came through from this association of Spanish citizens in San Francisco. Number two, in the 50s, the Moya Library, the library at UC Berkeley decided the lighting was not good enough, and so they had to drop down the ceiling to improve the lighting for the students that were reading the library itself. And the paintings didn't fit anymore, so they were put into storage. And then years later, the family complained that if the paintings were not going to be on show, they wanted to take them back. So some of them stayed at UC Berkeley, some of them went into the offices of the Spanish department. Some of them disappeared. It looks like they just got stolen while they were in storage, and among which what was stolen was Las Meninas, which is one of the biggest paintings by Velázquez that was ever done. And it's a huge painting, so we have no idea how that disappeared, but it did disappear. And the others were, some of them were sold at auction, and some of them were distributed among the children of Moya del Pino. A bulk of those were sent to my mother in Italy and got lost along the way. They got stolen either upon shipping or upon delivery in Naples, Italy. We have no idea. So essentially, very few of the paintings remain where we know. My family has some of them. Some of them have been sold, and we don't really know who the new owners are. We don't have auction records of the purchasers. We just have auction records of when they were sold and by which auction house. But the sad thing is that so many of them disappeared or were just stolen along the way. So the ones that my family has are the Four Jesters and one of the paintings of the Medici villas in Florence. I can't remember of any other specific ones, but they're scattered. They're scattered, and some of them we have no idea where. There's one of them. It's actually kind of interesting. There's an art collector in Hawaii that contacted us at a certain point saying that he had Los Borrachos, which is the triumph of Bacchus, I think, called in English, and that he had bought it at an auction. And that is one of the paintings that we very definitely think was stolen, because that was in the shipment that was going to Italy. So that painting has disappeared and resurfaced in Hawaii. And he was asking us if we wanted to buy it. And unfortunately, the Moya Library doesn't really have the funds to make purchases. We rely on donations. So that's where the story kind of ends. He was planning on selling it, and now I don't know if he still has it or if he sold it to anybody else, but it was kind of interesting to see it show up again after so many years. It's not a very specific question, I'm sorry, it's just all over the place, but yeah, the paintings are all over the place. That's the problem.
Yeah, there's a lot to that. Here's another question. Have you put together a catalog of all the extant paintings Moya did, which might refer to your book, but tell us more about that.
Of all the extant paintings, is that what you said?
Yes.
We don't have a specific catalog of every single one. The last chapter of the book does have a summary of the ones that we know about. There are many that we just don't know. So we don't know all the portraits that were in single family in family homes by the people who commissioned them. We don't really know how many there are, but we have a number of photographs. We just don't have them labeled, and we don't know exactly who has them. There are some that we believe are in Spain. Like there's a portrait of a consul that was purchased in Barcelona about 8 or 9 years ago. So we believe it's in Spain somewhere, but we don't know who bought it. We have no idea who has the portrait of the King of Spain, for example, and that was put in auction as well, twice. We have records of it showing up in auction twice, but again, we don't know who bought it. Both times in the United States, to be honest. The portrait of Duke of Alba, we have no information. Miguel Forcada actually contacted the House of Alba, who confirmed that they don't have it. So we have put together a list of the paintings that we know about, but it's certainly not comprehensive at all. There are just too many that we don't know about. But several of them are still in our hands or in the hands of our friends or private collections that we are in touch with. So those at least we can list.
Right, we receive inquiries too. So it was quite a career he had. No understating that. Yeah, here's a suggestion. If there's any thought of an exhibition of his paintings, which would be quite an undertaking. But
I would love to do that, and especially because there's some paintings that we can get a hold of. Some of them are still in the hands of our family, and some that are not, but that we know where to get. And I think that would be great. I really, to be honest, don't know about how to go about doing it. The museum in the museum, it's not just of art, but it's of history in Oakland, has one of his paintings, for example. It's in storage. I talked to them about him, and they said they're not interested in doing anything about his portraits, but if we ever decide to do, or if they ever have a show that specifically talks about the WPA works, they would be interested in showing some of his work as well. I don't really know who to go to have a show done, but I think it would be very interesting, and it would be varied enough. We would have to figure out if we can focus it a little bit, maybe just on the landscapes, or maybe just on the WPA work, maybe just on the portraits. But there's a lot to show that we could put together. Right.
And it's wonderful, the audience we have, thinking of, here's the 1925, we're coming up on the centennial of that. What about, wouldn't it be wonderful, not to put this on you, Paula, but a talk and program at the DeYoung and or Bancroft Library? Sounds like a wonderful idea to me.
It's a great idea. Get us the contacts. I don't know who to talk to.
Berkeley can be difficult to get to, but they're out. I'm trying to get to all these. We can go over 12 o'clock, but we're not wedded to that time. So I guess a really quick, someone wanting to know if you can get the book without Amazon. And I think still working on details.
I am still working on details. Unfortunately, the company that I published it with allows me to buy it, not through Amazon, but they only publish through distributors. And what I can do is I can republish this with there's another company that I'd actually considered, which is called Blurb, and they do a much better quality work, but it's also way more expensive. So part of the problem is how much you're willing to spend. And I wanted to try and make this accessible. And I went through Ingram Publishing, which has outlets throughout the world. So it can be bought in Australia, it can be bought in Europe, but they are extremely slow. And they publish through outlets, so such as Amazon. So you would have to go through Amazon and pay their premium, unfortunately. If you go through Amazon and look at other ways of buying, there are some other options too, not just their $43 price, which is exorbitant. But if there is enough interest, I can upload this to another location as well. Unfortunately, it's not going to be any cheaper. Because what I have used is Lulu and Blurb, and they do a nice job. Actually, the paper quality is better, the ink quality is better, but it's comparably more expensive as well. But if there's enough interest, let me know, and I can, for higher qualities of the book, if you want it more as a coffee style book or something like that, I can do it. It's just, I just wanted to keep it accessible to everybody, and so I wanted to keep the price down.
Right. I would like to get to all of these questions. I think Joe will let me know when we need to wrap up, but here's a quick one I know you've worked on. What happened to the murals Moya did for Rossi Brothers Pharmacy in San Anselmo?
So the pharmacy was torn down. George Lucas decided to donate a park to the town of San Anselmo, which was very well received, but the building was in the way. So the city council managed to designate the paintings a historical artwork or artifact, and were able to take them down before the building was torn down. And they donated them to the Spanish consulate in San Francisco, who didn't have the space to post them, to put them up on the wall. So they gave them, I'm not sure if it's on loan or if it's a donation, to the Hispanic community. Oh my God, I always forget their name, but it has the word Hispanic in it, in Daly City. It's actually a community center that offers scholarships and community events for people of Spanish descent. Not generally Hispanic as in South America, but specifically Spanish, European Spanish descent. And they have a number of different programs, and they do have it up. And it's viewable to members, of course. If somebody's interested, they told me that with advance notice, they could open it up to non-members as well, but it kind of needs to be arranged specifically in advance. But yeah, so they're still up. They haven't been lost.
Great. Let's try to get through a few more. And I think hopefully we've been able to capture the chat. This is certainly great to hear all the input from everyone watching today. Here, your grandfather was so talented, and just as you ended your talk, you touched on the question. This talented artist was doing commissioned paintings for money, but as a passionate artist, he must have wanted to do just his own art. Anything you can say about that? Or
yes, he did. He did, and we have, it was just a little bit too much to talk about, but like these landscapes, for example, this is from a particular phase of his life, the one that I still had on the screen at the end. Some of them are more abstract, some of them are more figurative, but there are a lot of paintings that he's had on shows at various different times. There's one that I absolutely love, and that luckily I'm lucky enough to actually have, that is called Like Seals, and it's very gloomy, it's very dark colors, and it has these women drying themselves off the rocks after a swim at night. Just to give you an example of the breadth of his work. there are a lot of them. And again, if we were to do a show, we would be able to bring out a number of things. He primarily was a figurative painter, but his idea of figurative painting changed a little bit. At the beginning, it was really trying to get reality as much as possible. Then he went through a somewhat abstract phase and then went back to figurative, saying that the figurative actually had to capture more the essence than the exact photographic quality of what he was looking at. And I think that the Joshua Tree paintings, for example, are an example of that, where you get the idea of the contorted shapes, but it's not necessarily pictorially exact. There are a lot of them. And for those, we have a little bit more information on the ones, well, not all of them, but the book has some pictures of some of them, still lives, for example, and other paintings of people or for his family, and just things that he'd like to do by himself, because he had a studio in the garden at the back of his house and he just painted constantly.
Right. And someone did ask where he lived in Marin, and can you tell us where that house is?
So he lived in Ross, and he lived practically around the block from the Marin Art and Garden Center. The house is not in the family anymore, but the house was built by Gardner Daly. And I think it's just 2 blocks away on Laurel Grove Avenue in Ross,
Right.
California.
It is still there, I can assure you. Yes. Was there one gift Moya gifted to the history of art and design? What do you think?
To the history of art and design in general, you mean?
Yeah, if you were to think of something quick to say.
Oh my God, that's a hard question to ask.
I think it is.
I'm not sure, because he was so spread out. Were important to him, for example, but teachers come and go. I think I'd have to think about that one a little bit.
Right. I think that's, yeah, I kind of threw that at, but something to think about. Other people would find it interesting to see who his students were at the Art Institute. I'm sure there'd be ways. There's so many areas you can go into.
That's a subject for a future book.
Right. And questions on visiting the library, I think we'll have to work details out for that.
Especially this year that we can't really do much in person at all, but next year should be more flexible.
Did you want to add anything, Joe? Well, I guess the last question, I don't think you ever met him in person, did you?
Myself?
Moya, right.
Yes, I did.
Okay.
I did, but so the problem was that I lived in Italy,
right,
when I was a child, and he lived out here, and we only came out for either summer or Christmas vacations, and not even every year. I mostly remember, not from when I was really a baby or a child, but I remember him from when I was about 8 years old. And at that point, it was 7 or 8 or something like that. And at that point, it really was the last years of his life. And then it's kind of interesting. I was a child and I was not paying attention to things very much. He was already in a wheelchair, and I don't think I ever really noticed. It just didn't register. I'm just a kid hanging out with grandparents. I do remember not understanding him very well, because his English, even, at that point he did speak English, but his was very accented, and my English was not very good. Mine didn't really get better until I came out here for college. So the communication was, again, by gestures. As I'm Italian, I gesticulate, and he's Spanish, he gesticulates. So it was mainly through that and facial expressions. I do remember him laughing a lot, even though I think it might have been hard for him because he was not feeling very well back then. He had diabetes, and he had lost his leg by the time I actually remember him more specifically. But yes, I did meet him.
Well, good. I'm glad that was the last question. We hadn't talked about that before, and it's good. I mean, when we're younger, we don't always remember, but it sounds like you have that to hold on to.
Well, I think that's most of the questions. I know that on the chat, and Paula, you can see this, lots of compliments on your presentation, gorgeous illustrations, the pictures of some of those rooms, stunning rooms, gorgeous art. It goes on and on. You can see the chat, and we appreciate all those comments. I'm sure Paola does.
I'll have to read them. I was trying to focus on a talk and I haven't read the
it's
chat very
hard.
well, but I'll go through it.
And they mentioned his work at Marin Ship. That's a whole story of its own too.
That's another story also, yes. And I think it's a very interesting story. There was just too much to cover for this presentation. I had to excise.
Well, we'll need to have you back. Back for more.
We can certainly do that. And look, if we didn't get to your questions, or you just want to reach out to Paola, email us, go to our website and email us at the Moya Library, Ross Historical Society, and Paola is a trustee of the organization. She will certainly get your message. So feel free to reach out to us. That's about all I have. Thank you, everybody. This was our best attended event this year. For this season, this was the best attended First Friday forenoon program. So congratulations, Paola. We will definitely have to have you back. And that's about all I have. Thanks for sticking around, everybody. This will be available in a few days on our website. You can watch it again or tell your friends, send them the link. It's right there, free to watch anytime you'd like. Anything else from anyone?
Thank you so much for attending. You guys, thank you so much. It means a lot to me because I've been really wanting to get the word out about my grandfather. I'm so impressed with his work and fascinated by it. And I worry that he's kind of getting forgotten a little bit, but he was a prominent figure for several years, both in Madrid and then in California later. So it really means a lot to me that you've come to check out and hear a little bit more about his history and his life.
Great. Thank you again. Thank you, everybody, for joining us, and have a wonderful day. Thank you, Paola.
Thank you.